Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is African Americans and the Constitution, and we're fortunate to have with us the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Tennessee State University, Dr. BLovett. And of course, Dr. Lovett, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Haney.
You know, Dr. Lovett, I think we've had an opportunity, excuse me, to talk to you on a number of occasions dealing with the African American experience in the New World, the African American experience during the Revolutionary War, and et cetera. But we've never had an opportunity really to talk to you about the topic that we're going to deal with today, that is the African Americans and the Constitution. And let's do that, but before we do that, let's give you an opportunity to talk about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in your career, and eventually, excuse me, leading you to the Dean of Arts of the College of Arts and Sciences at Tennessee State University. And then we'll talk about some other aspects of the African American experience that eventually led to the Constitution.
Well, Dr. Haney, I'm a native of Memphis, Tennessee. Completed high school, Booker T. Washington High School in Memphis. Attended college at Arkansas, aiming in at Pine Bluff, and received my master's and PhD degrees at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and completed studies at Howard University and at Columbia University in New York City. And I taught high school in Memphis for a year, American history, after college. Then I went to Illinois to work at Eureka College for several years, and I came to TSU to take up the job of instructor of history and political science. And I have been at Tennessee State University for the last 26 years and served as department head, assistant dean, associate dean, and now I'm dean of arts and sciences.
Very good. You know, Dr. Lovett, I think that in your career dealing with the African American experience, you've got just a whole array of experiences. But let's talk about the African in the New World, so to speak, because I think it's quite obvious that when we deal with the black experience, we have to start in Africa. And let's have you to give us some information relative to the coming of Africans to the New World, both North America and South America, if you so desire, and to talk about it from that perspective.
Right. Well, few people know that slavery was already 100 years old when the first contingent of African slaves arrived in Jamestown in the year 1619. Slavery had been well established in South and Central America since 1513, 100 years before. And the slave trade had been going on really since about 1441. And by the time Columbus set sail to America in 1492, there were, for example, 25,000 West Africans living in Lisbon, for example. So Africans were in Europe as servants and workers and sailors long before the slave trade started. And in fact, many of them were just common workers aboard Columbus's ships when he set sail in 1492. A lot of that knowledge about navigating across the Atlantic he learned from them and from people in West Africa. And slavery finally established when the New World was so-called discovered by Columbus. By 1513, they're taking slaves across the Atlantic to work the sugar plantations and other farms, mostly in the West Indies. And that spreads into South America. And then about 100 years later, 1619, the first 20 Africans arrive in Jamestown, where they are sold to the English settlers. Between 1441 and about the time the slave trade stops, really in the 1870s, we estimate that about 15 million, that's a conservative estimate, about 15 million Africans were removed from mostly West Africa, with about 2% coming from east part of Africa. But about 30% of them came from the region that we would call Nigeria today. And about 28% of them came from the region of West Africa we would call Angola today. We have pretty good ship records, including at Tennessee State University, that are computerized, about 13,313 ship records, because the slavers or the captains kept pretty good logs, like a diary. Every time they picked up some cargo slaves on the West African coast, they told where they got them from, how much they paid for them, how many died aboard, where did they sell them.
So we have accurate information.
We have pretty good information, so we can trace them quite not easily, but there are pretty good records on it was a $17 billion business over that period of time. And one particular historian, Eric Williams, who was an West Indian, says in his book, Slavery and Capitalism, that American industry and European industry were basically financed by that trade. It generated a tremendous amount of profits. And those surplus profits went into really capitalizing the Industrial Revolution that England and Europe and eventually America capitalized on by the 17th and 18th centuries.
And so there's a long history of the labor that the economics of slavery played a very, very significant aspect in the coming of the Industrial Revolution. Is that?
Absolutely, and it also played a very important role in the industrialization of this country in the 19th century, especially in the early 1800s. And of course, it played a profound role in the economics of the South because slaveholding farms are much more productive than the free farms. And African American slaves also were the skilled people of the South. They were the stone cutters, they were the brick makers, the brick masons, they were the carpenters, they were the coopers, the stone cutters, they were the people who built the houses, they were the iron makers, which was a trade that went back further in West Africa than it did in Europe. And so about 80% of the semi-skilled and skilled workers in the South, believe it or not, were free blacks and slaves.
And so what we're saying is that when we see pictures of some of these old antebellum mansions and et cetera, we can assume that African Americans, that slaves themselves had played a significant role in the construction of these?
Absolutely. It was more likely that there was more slave labor involved in the building of those mansions than there was white labor. Most whites in the slave South were yeoman farmers. That is, they were subsistence farmers who worked their own families and made a living and so on. And only 20% of the people in the South were slave owners. But slaves made up almost 1/3 of the population of the South at that time. And so you couldn't have a ball without slave musicians. They were the ones who formed the bands. And two famous bands operated in Nashville during slavery, and that was one by Jim McGowan, Jordan, some called him Jordan McGowan, and the other one is Jim Hill. And those were the two largest string bands, as they call them, in that day and time. For example, the banjo is an African-American instrument. It's now more a country western instrument, but African-Americans taught Americans how to play that instrument. So that was one of the major instruments in the slave bands during slavery times.
And so African Americans played a very, very significant role in American history with the establishment of the colonies and even that period thereafter. Let's have you to talk about, give us some general information about slavery during the colonial period so that we can talk about the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution.
Well, as we said, slavery developed first in the colony of Virginia with the coming of about 20 Africans sold by a Dutch vessel in 1619. But by, say, for example, 1750, half of Virginia's population consists of African Americans. And Virginia is the largest of the states right after the American Revolution. Most of the slaves were in Virginia, the North Carolina, South Carolina colony, and the Georgia colony. A lesser number were in the middle colonies like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and that area. And very few in New England, where New England's economy was based on shipping and industry and small industry. Manufacturing was just beginning in the 18th century. In America, mostly distilleries and shipbuilding and things of that particular sort. So there were very few. For example, Massachusetts had more free blacks than slaves by 1780 when the American Revolution came about. So slaves were scattered in all of the 13 colonies, all the way from New York to Georgia, but they were concentrated most heavily in the southern colonies where the cash crops of tobacco, cotton, indigo, and lumber were.
And let me interrupt here, Dr. Lovett, as we break for our first commercial break, and we'll be back with you following this short commercial. Arts and Sciences at Tennessee State